I'm Dr. Felicia Reeds, 39 years old, and 3 years ago, something happened at the university where I work that changed everything. I was standing in the hallway after a faculty meeting when our admissions director looked me straight in the eye and said, "I only got my position because of affirmative action, not because I was qualified." My heart stopped, but what the administration did next was even worse. If you've ever experienced racism in your workplace, school, or any professional setting, please let me know where you're watching from and subscribe to join others who understand this struggle. Growing up in Birmingham, Alabama, I learned early that excellence wasn't optional in my family. My grandmother, who cleaned houses for white families during the day and studied by candlelight at night to get her teaching certificate, used to tell me, "Baby, you gotta be twice as good to get half as much, but that don't mean you can't get it." She'd passed down this wisdom after watching my grandfather denied promotions at the steel mill despite outworking everyone around him. My parents, both educators, built on that foundation. They saved every penny to send me to science camps, bought encyclopedias instead of new furniture, and drove me 2 hours each way to Saturday math programs at Tuskegee University. Sunday dinners at our house were strategy sessions disguised as family time. While my mother's cornbread cooled on the stove and the aroma of her famous pot roast filled our small kitchen, we'd discuss current events, solve math problems together, and talk about what I was learning in school. My father would quiz me on everything, from multiplication tables to the periodic table, while my mother shared stories about the civil rights pioneers she'd taught alongside. They never let me forget that education was our pathway to freedom, but they also prepared me for the reality that some people would always question whether I belonged in certain spaces. "When they doubt you," my mother would say, "stirring greens and wisdom together, let your work speak so loud they can't ignore it." By high school, I was valedictorian, captain of the debate team, and had already scored a perfect 800 on the math portion of my SATs. When I got my acceptance letter to MIT with a full scholarship, our whole neighborhood celebrated. Mrs. Johnson from next door brought over her famous peach cobbler, and Pastor Reeds announced it during Sunday service at Macedonia Baptist Church. I remember sitting in that sanctuary, surrounded by faces that looked like mine, all beaming with pride, as if my success belonged to all of us. In many ways it did. This community had raised me, supported me, and believed in me when the world outside often didn't. College brought new challenges and new victories. At MIT, I was often the only Black woman in my engineering classes, but I'd been prepared for this reality. I remembered my parents' lessons about code switching, about when to speak up and when to strategically gather allies. I found mentorship through the National Society of Black Engineers and formed study groups with other students of color who understood the unique pressure we faced. We supported each other through the isolation, the microaggressions from professors who seemed surprised by our intelligence, and the loneliness of being constantly questioned about our presence in these spaces. My undergraduate research on renewable energy systems caught the attention of my professors, and I published 2 papers before graduation. Graduate school at Stanford followed, then my doctorate, and finally my dream job offer, assistant professor of environmental engineering at Preston University, one of the most prestigious programs in the country. By the time I arrived at Preston, I had published 15 peer-reviewed articles, secured 2 major research grants, and been featured in Scientific American for my work on sustainable urban planning. I wasn't just qualified for this position, I was exceptional. Those first 5 years at Preston flew by in a blur of research breakthroughs and recognition. My lab became known for innovative approaches to environmental justice, combining cutting-edge technology with community-centered solutions. I secured a $1, $2 million grant from the National Science Foundation, the largest in our department's history. My work was featured in the New York Times when we developed a water purification system that could serve low-income communities worldwide. Students lined up to work in my lab, and I mentored a diverse group of young researchers who were changing the face of environmental engineering. I bought my first house in Preston's historic Oak Grove neighborhood, a beautiful Victorian that I lovingly restored on weekends. My parents visited every Thanksgiving, and my mother would marvel at the built-in bookshelves I'd filled with my research publications and the awards lining my office walls. "Look at what God can do," she'd whisper, running her fingers along my National Young Investigator Award. I was living the dream we'd all worked toward, proof that excellence could overcome any barrier. The university recognized my contributions too. I was promoted to associate professor, with tenure 2 years early, the first Black woman to achieve this milestone in our department. I served on important committees, was invited to speak at international conferences, and began to feel genuinely settled in this space I'd worked so hard to enter. I started a mentorship program for students of color in STEM, hosting monthly dinners at my house, where we discuss everything from research strategies to navigating predominantly white institutions. These young people reminded me why this work mattered, not just the research, but the representation. By my 6th year, I was thriving in ways I'd only imagined as that little girl solving math problems at my grandmother's kitchen table. I'd established the Reeds Center for Environmental Justice, secured partnerships with community organizations across the Southeast, and was being considered for department chair. My research had directly impacted policy in 3 states, and I'd been invited to testify before Congress about environmental racism. I felt invincible, surrounded by the respect I'd earned and the community I'd built. But success in predominantly white spaces has a way of making some people uncomfortable, especially when that success belongs to someone who wasn't supposed to be there in the first place. I started noticing subtle changes in how some colleagues interacted with me. Comments about diversity initiatives whenever my name came up for awards or opportunities, suggestions that my research was too focused on race when environmental justice had always been central to environmental science. Questions about whether my students were being adequately challenged in my courses, despite our department's highest graduation rates and job placement statistics. The whispers grew louder during faculty meetings. I'd catch fragments of conversations that stopped when I entered rooms. Dr. Henderson, who'd never published in a journal half as prestigious as those that regularly featured my work, began questioning my methodology during department seminars. Dr. Morrison, whose own research hadn't been cited in 5 years, suggested that my grant success might be due to special considerations rather than merit. I documented everything, maintaining my professionalism, while privately wondering if I was being paranoid or appropriately cautious. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in October, right after our monthly faculty meeting, where we discussed admissions decisions for the upcoming academic year. I just presented data showing that our department's diversity initiatives were improving both academic outcomes and research innovation, concrete proof that inclusion strengthened our program. As we filed out of the conference room, Dr. Robert Steinberg, our admissions director, approached me with what I initially thought was a collegial smile. But then he said it, his voice carrying just far enough for several colleagues to hear. "You know, Felicia, it's interesting how passionate you are about diversity. I guess you'd have to be, considering you probably only got your own position here because of affirmative action, not because you were actually the most qualified candidate." He paused, his smile becoming more pointed. "I mean, we all know how these things work these days." The hallway went silent. Dr. Peterson, who'd been discussing weekend plans with Dr. Chen, stopped mid-sentence. Graduate students walking past slowed their pace, sensing the tension. I felt my face grow hot, my grandmother's voice echoing in my mind. "When they show you who they are, believe them the first time." But I also heard my mother's wisdom about choosing battles wisely and fighting strategically. "I'm sorry, Robert," I said, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. "But I think you may be confused about how faculty hiring works. My position was earned through peer review of my research, my teaching excellence, and my contributions to the field. Perhaps you'd like to review my CV to refresh your memory about my qualifications." I kept my tone professional, but several colleagues had stopped to listen, and I wanted them to hear his response. Dr. Steinberg's face reddened slightly, but he doubled down. "Oh, I'm not questioning your accomplishments, Felicia. I'm just pointing out that sometimes qualified candidates get passed over to meet certain quotas. It's nothing personal, just the reality of today's hiring climate." He shrugged as if discussing the weather. "I'm sure you understand the position that puts the rest of us in." Dr. Jennifer Walsh, one of the few colleagues I considered a genuine ally, stepped closer. "Robert, that's completely inappropriate. Dr. Reeds is one of our department's most accomplished faculty members," but her defense felt like a whisper against the thunder of his accusation. Other colleagues found sudden interest in their phones or hurried past as if they hadn't heard anything. "I'll be reporting this conversation to the department chair," I said, my voice cutting through the awkward silence. Comments like that create a hostile work environment and reflect poorly on our institution's values. I gathered my materials and walked toward my office, my mind already racing through the documentation I'd need to gather and the conversations I'd need to have. That night, I sat in my kitchen, the same space where I'd celebrated my hiring with champagne and my parents' proud tears, and I realized that some battles choose you whether you're ready or not. I called my mother first, needing her voice and wisdom to center me for what I knew would be a long fight ahead. "Baby," she said after I'd recounted the day's events, "your grandmother always said that some folks can't see excellence when it's wearing black skin. But that don't make your excellence any less real. You document everything. You fight smart, and you remember that you're not just fighting for yourself, you're fighting for every little black girl who's gonna come after you. The next morning, I requested a meeting with Department Chair Dr. Patricia Holbrook, gathering my documentation and preparing for what I hoped would be a straightforward conversation about addressing workplace discrimination. I'd known Pat for 6 years, had served on committees with her, and considered our relationship professional and respectful. Surely she would understand the seriousness of Dr. Steinberg's comments and take appropriate action. Her corner office, with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the campus quad, had always felt welcoming before. Today, the autumn sunlight streaming across her mahogany desk seemed harsh and exposing. I presented the facts clearly. Dr. Steinberg's exact words, the witnesses present, and the context that made his comments particularly damaging given his role in admissions decisions. Felicia, Dr. Holbrook said, leaning back in her leather chair with a concerned expression that I was beginning to recognize as performative rather than genuine. I appreciate you bringing this to my attention. Robert can be direct in his communication style, but I'm wondering if there might have been some misunderstanding about his intent. There was no misunderstanding about his words, I replied, pulling out my phone where I'd typed his exact quotes immediately after the conversation. He explicitly stated that I received my position due to affirmative action rather than qualifications, and he did so in front of colleagues and students. This isn't about communication style, it's about racial discrimination. Dr. Holbrook shifted uncomfortably, straightening papers on her desk that didn't need straightening. I hear your concerns, and I want you to know that we take all complaints seriously. However, Robert has been with this institution for 15 years and has an exemplary record. Perhaps we could arrange a mediated conversation where you both could clarify your perspectives. The suggestion felt like a slap. Pat, with respect, there's nothing to clarify. He questioned my qualifications based on my race, not my performance. Would you suggest mediation if he'd questioned a white colleague's credentials in the same way? I watched her face carefully, seeing the calculation behind her diplomatic expression. Felicia, I understand you're upset, but we need to be careful about attributing motives without clear evidence of discriminatory intent. Robert may have been insensitive, but that doesn't necessarily constitute racial discrimination as defined by university policy. She reached for a thick manual on her shelf. Let me review the specific procedures for filing a formal complaint, and we can discuss your options. As she flipped through pages about grievance procedures and investigation timelines, I realized that I was experiencing the institutional gaslighting that so many before me had warned about. The system was designed to protect itself, not the people it claimed to value. My documented evidence would become perspective, my lived experience would become interpretation, and the burden of proof would shift entirely to me. I'll be filing a formal complaint, I said, standing to leave, and I'll be documenting this conversation as well. I paused at her door, looking back at a woman I'd once respected. Pat, you know my record. You know my qualifications. You were on the committee that hired me. The fact that you're entertaining the possibility that Robert's comments were anything other than discriminatory tells me everything I need to know about how this institution really operates. The jury that afternoon, I called Dr. Sarah Washington, a civil rights attorney who'd spoken at one of our faculty development workshops years earlier. Felicia, she said after I'd explained the situation, what you're describing is textbook racial discrimination. The challenge is that universities have become very sophisticated at protecting themselves while appearing to follow proper procedures. You'll need to document everything from this point forward, and you'll need to be prepared for retaliation. Retaliation? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. Oh yes, they can't fire you outright. You have tenure, but they can make your life difficult in countless ways. Committee assignments, research support, teaching loads, office space, graduate student funding. The tools are subtle but effective. She paused. The question is whether you're prepared for that fight, because once you file this complaint, there's no going back to the way things were. I spent that evening walking through my neighborhood, past houses where families were settling in for dinner, children doing homework at kitchen tables, parents discussing their days. Normal people living normal lives, insulated from the particular exhaustion that comes with constantly proving your humanity in professional spaces. I envied them their simplicity, even as I knew that my fight was part of ensuring their children might face fewer battles. When I returned home, I found an email from Dr. Steinberg in my inbox. The subject line read, "Clarification of earlier conversation." My hands trembled slightly as I opened it, though I wasn't sure if it was from anger or anticipation. "Dear Felicia," it began, I wanted to follow up on our brief conversation yesterday to ensure there were no misunderstandings. I was simply observing that diversity initiatives have changed hiring practices across academia, which I'm sure you would agree has been beneficial for underrepresented groups. I hope we can continue to work together professionally and put any perceived slight behind us. Best regards, Robert. The email was a masterclass in gaslighting, reframing his overt racism as a benign observation about diversity while placing the burden of misunderstanding entirely on me. I forwarded it immediately to Dr. Washington with a note, exhibit bet, in whatever case we're about to build. Her response came within an hour. Perfect. He just documented his discriminatory mindset in writing while attempting to cover his tracks. Save everything. The next few weeks brought a subtle but unmistakable shift in my work environment. Suddenly, my graduate research assistants were reassigned to other projects without explanation. My requests for conference travel funding, previously approved without question, began requiring additional justification and approval from multiple committees. The Environmental Justice Center I'd built was relocated to a smaller space in the basement of the engineering building, far from the main department offices. Most telling was the response from colleagues. Those who'd witnessed Dr. Steinberg's original comments now seemed to have conveniently forgotten the details. I remember some tension, Dr. Peterson said, when I asked if he'd provide a statement, but I wasn't really paying attention to the specifics. Chen claimed she'd been too focused on her own conversation to hear what was said. One by one, potential witnesses developed sudden amnesia or discovered urgent reasons to avoid getting involved. Only Dr. Walsh remained supportive, but even she was careful about how publicly she expressed that support. Felicia, I think Robert was completely out of line, she said during a quietly arranged coffee meeting off campus. But I'm coming up for tenure review next year, and I can't afford to be seen as a troublemaker. I hope you understand. I did understand, perhaps better than she realized. The system was designed to isolate those who challenged it, making the cost of solidarity so high that even well-meaning allies found reasons to step back. It was a particular form of institutional cruelty. They didn't need to explicitly threaten anyone. The implied consequences were clear enough. My formal complaint triggered a months-long investigation that felt more like an inquisition. I was interviewed multiple times, asked to provide detailed documentation of every interaction I'd had with Dr. Steinberg over 6 years, and required to submit character references from colleagues who were increasingly reluctant to associate with me. Meanwhile, Dr. Steinberg continued his normal duties, receiving sympathy from colleagues about the difficult situation he was facing. The investigation report, delivered 4 months later, was a study in institutional self-protection. While acknowledging that Dr. Steinberg's comments were insensitive and inappropriate, it concluded that there was insufficient evidence to support a finding of racial discrimination. The report noted that he had no history of discriminatory behavior and that his comments could be reasonably interpreted as commentary on general hiring practices rather than a specific attack on Dr. Reeds' qualifications. The recommended remedy was mandatory diversity training for Dr. Steinberg and a written reprimand in his personnel file. The letter also suggested that I might benefit from professional development training on workplace communication and recommended that both parties participate in mediated conflict resolution sessions. I stared at the report in disbelief, seeing my lived experience reduced to a misunderstanding and my professional reputation indirectly questioned by the suggestion that I needed communication training. This was the moment I realized that the institution would never voluntarily acknowledge its failures or meaningfully address the racism within its ranks. That evening, I called my parents and read them the entire report. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, my father spoke, his voice heavy with a familiar weariness. "Baby girl, this is exactly what they did to me at the plant 40 years ago. Different words, same song. They'll protect their own no matter what evidence you put in front of them." He paused, and I could hear my mother's gentle murmur in the background. "But here's what we learned back then. Sometimes you got to take the fight outside their system to get any justice." My mother took the phone. "Felicia, honey, you've got something we didn't have back then. You've got credentials they can't question, resources they can't cut off, and a platform they can't silence. It's time to use all of that." She was right. I'd been playing by their rules, hoping their system would deliver justice. But systems designed to protect white supremacy will never voluntarily dismantle it. It was time to change the game entirely. The next morning, I called Dr. Washington back. Sarah, I need to understand my legal options. This internal process has been a sham from start to finish. I've been waiting for this call, she said. Based on what you've told me, you have strong grounds for a federal discrimination complaint and potentially a civil rights lawsuit. But Felicia, this is going to be a public fight. Are you prepared for your story to be in newspapers, for your colleagues to choose sides, for this to define how people see you for the foreseeable future? I thought about my grandmother, studying by candlelight after working all day in white women's kitchens. I thought about my parents, saving every penny to give me opportunities they'd been denied. I thought about the young Black women in my mentorship program, watching to see if speaking up about racism was worth the cost. Sarah, I said, I've been preparing for this fight my whole life. I just didn't know it would happen here. The decision to file a federal complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission marked the beginning of a new phase in this battle. Within days of the filing becoming public, the local newspaper picked up the story. Preston University professor alleges racial discrimination in federal complaint. The article was factual but sanitized, presenting both sides as equally valid perspectives rather than addressing the power dynamics and documented evidence involved. The university's response was swift and predictable. They issued a statement expressing their commitment to diversity and inclusion while denying any wrongdoing. Preston University has a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination, the statement read. We conducted a thorough internal investigation and found no evidence to support these allegations. We stand behind our faculty and our hiring practices. What they didn't mention was that their zero-tolerance policy had somehow tolerated Dr. Steinberg's comments enough to keep him in his position, with nothing more than a training session and a letter in his file. They also didn't mention that their thorough investigation had relied primarily on the testimony of white colleagues who had every incentive to minimize what they'd witnessed. The public nature of the complaint brought unexpected consequences. Students began reaching out, sharing their own experiences with Dr. Steinberg and other faculty members. Sarah Martinez, a Latina graduate student, sent me a detailed email about how Dr. Steinberg had questioned whether she was really ready for graduate-level work despite her perfect undergraduate GPA. Carl Johnson, a Black undergraduate, described how Dr. Steinberg had suggested he might be more comfortable in a less rigorous program. These stories painted a clear pattern of discriminatory behavior that the university's investigation had somehow missed. More importantly, they demonstrated that this wasn't an isolated incident involving just me, it was part of a systemic pattern of how the institution treated students and faculty of color. I began documenting these additional cases, reaching out to former students who might have similar experiences. What I discovered was stunning. Over the past 5 years, Dr. Steinberg had made racially charged comments to at least 8 students of color, questioned the qualifications of 3 other faculty members of color, and consistently voted against admitting students from historically Black colleges and universities. Armed with this new evidence, Dr. Washington and I requested a meeting with the university's legal team. The conference room in the administration building felt different this time. I was no longer a supplicant hoping for institutional justice, but an adversary presenting evidence of systematic discrimination. Reeds began General Counsel Patricia Morrison, we appreciate your willingness to meet and discuss these concerns. However, I hope you understand that the university maintains its position that no discrimination occurred. We're prepared to defend our actions and our personnel. I slid a thick folder across the polished conference table. Miss Morrison, this folder contains statements from 8 students documenting a pattern of discriminatory behavior by Dr. Steinberg spanning 5 years. It also includes data showing that during his tenure as admissions director, acceptance rates for students of color have dropped 23%, while acceptance rates for white students have remained steady. Dr. Washington leaned forward. Furthermore, we have evidence that the university's investigation was inadequate and potentially biased. Several potential witnesses were not interviewed, relevant documents were not reviewed, and the conclusion appears predetermined rather than evidence-based. The university's legal team exchanged glances, and I watched Miss Morrison's confident expression falter slightly as she flipped through the student statements. We'll need time to review these materials, she said finally. This meeting is concluded. As we gathered our materials to leave, I felt a shift in the dynamic. For the first time since this ordeal began, they looked concerned rather than dismissive. The evidence was becoming too substantial to ignore, and the potential liability too significant to brush aside. 2 weeks later, the university requested another meeting. This time, President Dr. Elizabeth Crawford was present, along with the full legal team and Dr. Holbrook. The atmosphere was formal and tense, with none of the patronizing warmth that had characterized earlier interactions. Dr. Reeds, President Crawford began, we've reviewed the additional materials you provided, and we're prepared to discuss a resolution to this matter. What kind of resolution? Dr. Washington asked, her tone professional but skeptical. We're prepared to offer Dr. Reeds a formal apology, a sabbatical year at full pay to pursue research opportunities, and assurance that Dr. Steinberg will receive additional sensitivity training, President Crawford said. We believe this addresses the concerns raised while allowing everyone to move forward professionally. I felt anger rise in my throat. After months of gaslighting, minimization, and institutional protection of racism, they were offering me what amounted to a paid vacation and a meaningless apology. Dr. Crawford, with respect, that offer doesn't address the systemic issues that allowed this discrimination to occur or ensure it won't happen to others. What would you consider an appropriate resolution? She asked, though her tone suggested she was asking reluctantly. Dr. Washington consulted her notes. Dr. Reeds would accept a resolution that includes a public acknowledgement that discrimination occurred. Dr. Steinberg's removal from the admissions director position, implementation of meaningful bias training for all faculty and staff, establishment of an independent ombudsman position for discrimination complaints, and a comprehensive review of admissions data for evidence of bias. The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, President Crawford responded, "Those demands are unreasonable and would set a dangerous precedent. We're not prepared to accept liability for alleged discrimination that our investigation found unsubstantiated. Then we'll see you in federal court," Dr. Washington replied, closing her briefcase with finality. The months that followed were intense and exhausting. The EEOC investigation proceeded alongside our preparation for a potential civil rights lawsuit. Media attention increased when student groups organized protests, supporting my case and demanding broader changes to university policies. The hashtag #JusticeForDredge Reeds began trending on social media, connecting my case to broader conversations about racism in academia. Support came from unexpected sources. Dr. Janet Coleman from Howard University's engineering department reached out to offer expert testimony about patterns of discrimination in STEM academia. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People's Legal Defense Fund offered resources and strategic advice. Most importantly, colleagues from other universities began sharing their own experiences with similar discrimination, creating a network of mutual support and shared strategy. The university's position became increasingly untenable as more evidence emerged. A former admissions committee member came forward with internal emails showing Dr. Steinberg making disparaging comments about applications from students at historically Black colleges. Another colleague revealed that Dr. Steinberg had privately referred to diversity initiatives as lowering standards during faculty meetings. The breakthrough came when Dr. Emily Rodriguez, a Latina professor who'd left Preston the previous year, agreed to testify about her own experiences with Dr. Steinberg. Her story was remarkably similar to mine, questioned qualifications, minimized achievements, and institutional gaslighting when she'd tried to address the discrimination. "Felicia," she told me during a long phone conversation, "I left because I didn't have the energy to fight that system anymore. But watching you stand up gives me hope that things might actually change for the people who come after us." The EEOC issued its determination 8 months after my initial complaint, reasonable cause to believe that discrimination had occurred. This federal finding gave us significant leverage in negotiations and potential litigation. More importantly, it validated what I'd known all along. This wasn't a misunderstanding or oversensitivity, but documented racial discrimination. The university requested a final settlement meeting before the case proceeded to federal court. This time they came prepared to make serious offers rather than dismissive gestures. Dr. Reeds, President Crawford began, her tone noticeably different from our previous encounters. "We're prepared to make a substantial offer to resolve this matter comprehensively." The terms they presented were significant. Dr. Steinberg would be removed from his admissions role and placed under investigation for violating university anti-discrimination policies. I would receive a public apology and financial compensation for the harm caused. The university would implement mandatory bias training and establish an independent equity office with real authority to investigate discrimination complaints. Most importantly to me, they agreed to conduct a comprehensive review of admissions practices and outcomes to identify and address any evidence of discriminatory patterns. This meant that the students whose stories had supported my case would finally see their experiences acknowledged and addressed. "There's one more condition," I said as the lawyers reviewed the proposed settlement terms. "I want to establish an endowed scholarship fund for students from underrepresented backgrounds pursuing environmental engineering. And I want Dr. Steinberg to make a public statement acknowledging that his comments about my qualifications were inappropriate and not reflective of university values." The university's legal team huddled for several minutes before President Crawford responded, "We can agree to support the scholarship fund, but we cannot require a specific public statement from Dr. Steinberg beyond what's outlined in the settlement terms." It wasn't everything I'd hoped for, but it was substantial progress. More importantly, the changes we'd negotiated would create lasting institutional improvements that would benefit future students and faculty. Sometimes progress comes in increments rather than revolutionary leaps. The settlement was announced 3 weeks later. The university's public statement acknowledged that regrettable comments had been made that were inconsistent with our values of inclusion and respect. While it stopped short of admitting racial discrimination, it represented a significant public acknowledgement that something serious had occurred. Steinberg's removal from the admissions director position was announced simultaneously, along with the establishment of the new equity office and mandatory bias training programs. The local newspaper coverage was extensive, and I was interviewed about my experience and the importance of institutional accountability. "This was never just about me," I told the reporter. "It was about creating an environment where the next Black woman, the next Latino student, the next person who doesn't fit traditional expectations, doesn't have to fight these same battles alone." The scholarship fund was established with an initial endowment of $250,000, providing full tuition support for 2 students annually. At the first scholarship ceremony, I met Maria Santos and Kevin Jackson, the inaugural recipients. Maria was a first-generation college student from El Salvador, whose passion for water resource management reminded me of my own journey. Kevin, a young Black man from rural Mississippi, wanted to develop sustainable energy solutions for low-income communities. "Reeds," Maria said after the ceremony, "my guidance counselor told me I should consider less competitive programs because students like me don't usually succeed in engineering. Thank you for proving her wrong and making it possible for me to be here." Her words brought tears to my eyes, reminding me why this fight had been necessary and worthwhile. Every barrier we break down makes the path easier for those who follow. The institutional changes took time to implement fully, but they were meaningful and measurable. The new equity office investigated 12 discrimination complaints in its first year, finding cause for action in 7 cases. The bias training programs were expanded beyond simple awareness sessions to include interactive workshops about recognizing and interrupting discriminatory behavior. Most significantly, admissions data showed marked improvements in diversity and inclusion. Applications from students of color increased 34% in the first year after the new policies were implemented, and acceptance rates became more equitable across racial and ethnic groups. The changes weren't just symbolic, they were creating real opportunities for students who had previously faced systemic barriers. My own research and teaching continued to thrive in this improved environment. The stress and emotional toll of fighting discrimination had been exhausting, but the validation and changes that resulted gave me renewed energy for my work. The Reeds Center for Environmental Justice expanded its programs, and I was promoted to full professor earlier than usual, recognition that my contributions had never been in question among those who truly understood merit and qualifications. The mentorship program I'd started for students of color grew into a formal initiative supported by the university, with dedicated funding and resources. Monthly dinners at my house became weekly meetings in dedicated campus space, with programming that included career development, research opportunities, and peer support networks. "Dr. Reeds," said Jasmine Thompson, a sophomore in our program, "my mom wanted me to thank you. She said that when she was in college, there wasn't anyone who looked like her in the science building. Now I can't imagine being here without this community you've built." Building community had indeed become central to my work, both inside and outside the university. I began speaking at conferences about recognizing and addressing discrimination in academic settings, sharing strategies that had proven effective in my case. Other faculty members facing similar challenges reached out for advice and support, creating a network of advocates for institutional change. The legal victory and institutional changes were important, but the personal healing and community building that followed were equally significant. I'd learned that fighting racism requires both individual courage and collective action, both immediate resistance and long-term strategy. Most importantly, I'd learned that speaking truth to power, while costly, can create changes that extend far beyond any single case or situation. 2 years after the settlement, I received an unexpected email from Dr. Steinberg. The subject line simply read, "Apology." Inside, he had written a brief but seemingly genuine acknowledgement that his comments had been inappropriate and hurtful, and that he was committed to doing better. It wasn't the public statement I'd originally wanted, but it felt like a small sign that even the most resistant people can sometimes grow and change. Whether his change was genuine or strategic, the institutional changes we'd achieved were creating a different culture where such comments were less likely to be tolerated or ignored. New faculty orientation now included extensive discussion of bias and inclusion, and student feedback consistently showed improved experiences across racial and ethnic groups. Looking back on this experience, I'm often asked whether I would do it again, knowing the personal cost and professional risk involved. The answer is always yes, because I understand now that this fight was never just about me. It was about every student of color who deserved to see themselves reflected in faculty and leadership positions. It was about every young researcher whose innovative ideas might be dismissed because of their background rather than evaluated on their merit. It was about my grandmother who studied by candlelight because she believed education could change everything. It was about my parents who sacrificed to give me opportunities they'd been denied. And it was about the little black girls who will grow up in a slightly more just world because some of us were willing to fight for it. The scholarship recipients send me updates regularly, sharing their research progress and career plans. Maria is developing water purification systems for underserved communities in Latin America. Kevin is designing solar energy solutions for rural areas in the South. They're both thriving academically and professionally, proof that talent and potential exist everywhere when given genuine opportunity. Their success validates what I've always known but couldn't always prove: diversity in academia isn't about lowering standards or filling quotas. It's about recognizing excellence wherever it exists and removing the barriers that prevent talented people from contributing their gifts to our collective knowledge and progress. The Reeds Center for Environmental Justice has become a model for community-engaged research, attracting attention from universities across the country. We've secured additional funding to expand our work, and our research has directly influenced policy changes in 6 states. The work itself, developing sustainable solutions for environmental challenges facing marginalized communities, has become more impactful because the discrimination fight forced us to think more strategically about systemic change. I've also learned that justice work is ongoing and requires constant vigilance. The systems that protected racism didn't disappear overnight, and new challenges continue to emerge. But the networks we built, the policies we changed, and the precedents we established create resources for addressing future problems more effectively. For those watching this video who have experienced similar discrimination, I want you to know that you're not alone and you're not imagining things. Racism in academic and professional settings is real, documented, and actionable. You have rights, resources, and a community of people who understand what you're facing. Document everything. Keep records of incidents, witnesses, and institutional responses. Build alliances with colleagues and community members who share your values. Seek legal advice early to understand your options and timelines. Most importantly, remember that fighting discrimination is not just about seeking individual justice. It's about creating institutional changes that benefit everyone. Connect with organizations like the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, your local ACLU chapter, or professional associations in your field that have civil rights resources. Find attorneys who specialize in employment discrimination and understand the unique challenges facing people of color in predominantly white institutions. But also remember to care for yourself throughout the process. Fighting discrimination is emotionally and physically exhausting. Build support systems, seek counseling if helpful, and remember that your worth and qualifications were never actually in question. You're fighting against systems designed to make you doubt yourself. For allies watching this video, understand that racism in academic and professional settings persists because good people remain silent when they witness it. Being an ally means being willing to speak up even when it's uncomfortable, even when it might cost you something. It means using your privilege and position to amplify voices like mine rather than waiting for us to fight these battles alone. When you witness discrimination, document it and offer to serve as a witness. When you're in hiring or admissions committees, advocate for diverse candidates and challenge biased language or assumptions. When you see colleagues being treated unfairly, speak up in the moment rather than offering private sympathy after the fact. Most importantly, examine your own biases and assumptions. We all have them, and acknowledging them is the first step toward preventing discrimination rather than perpetuating it. Attend training sessions, read books by authors from different backgrounds, and listen to experiences that differ from your own. The changes we achieved at Preston University are proof that institutions can evolve when held accountable. But change doesn't happen automatically. It requires persistent pressure from people willing to speak up and fight back against injustice. If you found this story helpful or encouraging, please subscribe to this channel and share it with others who might benefit from hearing it. Use the comments section to share your own experiences, resources, or words of encouragement for others facing similar challenges. Building community and sharing knowledge are essential parts of creating the changes we need. Remember that every person who stands up against discrimination makes it easier for the next person to speak up. Every policy change we achieve benefits countless people who will never know our names. Every barrier we break down creates opportunities for talent and innovation that might otherwise be lost. This is how progress happens, not through dramatic overnight transformations, but through persistent pressure from people who refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. Your voice matters, your experience is valid, and your fight for dignity and respect contributes to a larger movement for equity and justice. The little girl solving math problems at her grandmother's kitchen table could never have imagined she'd one day be fighting federal discrimination cases and changing university policies. But she was being prepared for exactly this work through every lesson about excellence, every conversation about resilience, and every reminder that her presence in certain spaces would itself be an act of resistance. If you're that little girl or boy today, dreaming of careers in fields where you don't see many people who look like you, know that the path is still difficult but slightly easier because others have fought these battles before you. Your dreams are valid, your potential is real, and the barriers in your way are not permanent features of the landscape. They're obstacles that can be moved through collective action and individual courage. The work continues, the community grows stronger, and the future becomes more just with every person who refuses to accept discrimination as the price of professional success. Thank you for watching, for listening, and for being part of this ongoing fight for equality and justice.